Alright, Darksiders, here we go. Episode 4 of Lovecraft County, A History of Violence. And let me just say, this was a wild episode. Let's dive deep. So this episode opens with Montrose on the couch, who is drunk and in a little bit of a drunken stupor. Now, he can hear what's going on the radio and hear the announcer talking about what's happening with the war at present. All of this is getting mixed up in his head with the thoughts of what happened to him as he was abused as a child and the traumatic events that happened to them in Arnhem. He hears the voice of Uncle George saying that he has to protect his family, and all of the pressure of these voices in his head rouses him, and he gets up from his stupor and he goes throughout the house. Now, he comes across the book of bylaws by the Ancient Order of Dawn, and then he begins to read the first page of that book, but he decides to burn the book, so he throws it in a trash can, pours alcohol on it, and sets it on fire. And as it's burning, I think we get our first Easter egg of this episode, where Montrose says it smells like Tulsa. Now, this obviously is a reference to the burning of Greenwood in Tulsa, Oklahoma, which was known as Black Wall Street, a very prominent African-American town that was doing well for itself. People didn't like that, so the Klan came and not only burned down the town, but also killed a lot of people in the town as well. So then we jump to Christina, who is speeding through the town like a boss, I have to say, in her car. I really do love her character. Now, she's on her way to Letty's house. So when she pulls up in front of the house, we see a sign on the ground that says Blacks and an arrow pointing towards the house. So Christina walks up to the house with that swagger that she has, and she tries to walk right in the house saying, "May I come in?" And boom, she's hit by a barrier. Now, this is interesting to me because this reminds me of Atticus trying to come out of his room, and he's hit by the barrier of the spell that Christina is cast. And now Christina, trying to get into the house, is also hit by a barrier. Now, what I thought was cool about this scene is the symmetry between the signs and the runes used here. You can see when Atticus tries to come out of the room in episode 2 that the runes light up and he's not able to break that barrier. But you also see the sign that's causing the barrier with Christina as she tries to enter the house as well in episode 4. Look, Christina, you ain't the only one that could cast a barrier spell. Letty has met her at the door and she realizes now that she can't come in. The two of them have a conversation, and that's when Letty finds out that Christina actually gave her the money to buy the home. So Christina explains to Letty that she wants to come in because she's looking for something. Now, here's an interesting thing. She's looking for the orrery that we know that Hippolyta found during the party. But Letty doesn't want to give her any information, so she says she's not telling her anything. And basically, Christina tries to persuade her that don't let the men fool you. All that you think is going on with them is not what's going on. And Atticus himself is not actually even that powerful. Except for the fact that he has Titus's blood in him, there's nothing real powerful about him. And then she proceeds to tell him that Atticus tried to kill her, and Letty is shocked by this because she didn't know. So as the conversation goes on, Christina tells her that the orrery is somewhere in the house because Letty has no idea what this is. Here's an important point that goes back to episode 3. Now think about this, Darksiders. If we go back to episode 3 and we think about when Letty was getting the house ready and she had some of her tenants moving in and she yells upstairs. Now think about this, Darksiders. You remember in episode 3 when tenants are moving into the house and Letty and the tenants are getting things together and someone yells from upstairs down to her, "Do you know that one of these doors up here are locked?" And Letty's response is to pick it. I believe that scene is a direct reference to what Christina is talking about when she says that Hiram keeps the orrery in one of the rooms that are locked in the house. That is the same room that Hippolyta came across, but the room was not locked. We know now that the door was open, and we suspect, or I suspect, that Hiram was the one that opened that door. For whatever reason, I believe that Hiram knew that either Hippolyta was drawn to the orrery because there was a connection between her and the orrery, or he knew that Christina was looking for the orrery and he used Hippolyta to remove the orrery from the house. That's just a theory. Let's keep going. So next we pick up with Hippolyta in Uncle George's shop, and she's examining the orrery while talking to her father. Now, I think this is one of the most important scenes in this show because we get a bit of information that could be monumental as we move throughout the rest of this series. Now, you remember as she's having that conversation with her father, she's asking about the constellation or the structure of the orrery, and they're asking about the fact that there are two suns. And her father says they're probably eclipsing one another, but she says, what if they're actually two suns? Now, if we go back to episode 2 and we remember when Uncle George and Letty were in the woods and he stops because he has a recollection. And he remembers the story that Atticus's mom told her about a slave who escaped the house because the house was on fire. But then he also remembers the reference from William where William says that Titus was known for being notoriously generous to his, important point here, slaves, plural. So from that conversation, they figure out that that slave that was running through the woods was probably impregnated by Titus. So we know at this point that Uncle George has found the bylaws of the Ancient Order of Dawn, and he's going to use that to try and get themselves out of trouble at this dinner, where he goes on to explain that Atticus might be the last living heir through the bloodline of Titus. Now, the operative word here is might be. I believe that when we look at the two references from episode 2, and then we think about what Hippolyta says as she's looking at the orrery, and she says, what if there are 2 sons, that is a direct correlation to get us to think that, you know what, Atticus might not be the only one that's part of the last bloodline directly descendant of Titus. So next we jump to Letty, who is hot. She's upset and she's going to find Atticus, who apparently she knows is at the library. So Atticus is there trying to do some research. He's trying to find some information about the hidden spells so that maybe he can learn the language and learn some things to protect his family. So she comes in and she confronts him about all that's going on with Christina and all that was said there, and she's upset because she finds out that he, one, tried to kill Christina, and also she's mad because she knows now that he knew who gave her the money from the house but didn't say anything. So Atticus is like, listen, yo, I was trying to protect you, that's why I didn't say anything. And then she asks, well, what happens? How come you didn't kill Christina? She finds out that Atticus tried to, but he couldn't because obviously she has a spell on her. So this is where we get another Easter egg, or a bit of a foreshadowing to come. We see the little kid who is reading the book Journey to the Center of the Earth, who tells them several times to be quiet, and that is a little bit of a foreshadowing of what's to come later on in the episode. So the two of them have this conversation, and Atticus is saying, listen, I'm trying to find out what's going on. Letty wants to help. Atticus doesn't want her help, nor does he want his father's help, because Letty says that you need to talk to your father because he might have more information than you. Atticus says no and asks her to leave, and he begins to again study the books. Now here's another interesting thing that we get from this scene, and it's a visual cue, not a dialogue cue, so you really had to be paying attention to it. Did you notice when Atticus was looking at the names of who checked out the book, he could see that Montrose was one of the people who checked out the book. But what I also found that was curious, when Atticus began to look through other books that he was researching, he could see that Montrose had also checked out those books, but all of the different names on the cards in the different books were the same people. And I think that that's significant. So that's another cue to pay attention to, because we'll see if those names bear out some important fact later on in the season. So Atticus at this point realizes that he's going to have to talk to his father, so his father might be helpful. So he goes to the bar where Atticus's father normally is, and he's told that he's in the back. Now when he comes to the back of the room, he sees that Letty is already there and she is having a conversation with Montrose. So Atticus essentially asks Montrose to help, and Montrose says, no, I'm not going to help you. I don't want to help you kill yourself. But then Montrose gives out some important information that causes us to think, okay, you know about more that's going on here than you're letting on, because he mentions all the different lodges that could potentially come after them. Now the interesting thing here is that Atticus says this, but he doesn't follow up on it at all. He kind of just lets it go and looks at Addie and says, see, I told you this was a waste of time. And he leaves. So Letty looks at Montrose and says, it's a shame that you're going to let him chase his tail when you know you have information that could be helpful. And then she gets up to leave. Before she can leave, Montrose stops her and says, do you have any family in Boston? I think I know where you can find the vault. So next we find Christina, who is playing a weird game of hide and seek with kids. Now there might be something significant here that I missed, and if I did, please let me know what that is in the comments, Darksiders. But we do know that from this game, the police pull up and they actually take her away, and then they take her to see who I believe is a chief of police. Now the interesting thing is they do not take her to a precinct, they take her to some bar, and this police is in a hidden room, and we can tell that by how that door opens, and it looks like a solid wall on the opposite side. So that room is a hidden place. She has a conversation with the police officer there who wants to know why she's in town, who gave her permission to be in town, and now we find out that this police officer is actually affiliated with the sect of the Order of Ancient Dawn that is existent in that very town. And then we move on to find that Letty, Atticus, and Montrose are getting ready to hit the road on their way to Boston to try and find the secret vault. But as the scene unfolds, we find that some folks are joining them. Hippolyta and her daughter Diana, and Tree actually comes along for the ride as well. So they all are on their way to the museum. Hippolyta and her daughter are there because they're excited about an astrology exhibit that they have, but the others are there to find the vault. And of course, Tree is tagging along because he's trying to make his way to, I believe it's Philadelphia. Then we jump to Ruby, who we know has been preparing for a long time to try and get the job at the upscale clothing store. She comes in and she finds that someone else has gotten the job, another black young lady that actually just got the job, I believe, a day before her, and at that she got the job on a whim. So we find her very distraught about losing that position. We move back to Atticus and the others who have arrived at the museum in Boston. When they get there, they all split up. Hippolyta and her daughter go to the astrology exhibit. Tree goes somewhere else, but not before he has an interesting conversation with Atticus, insinuating that Montrose might have affections for men. And then we jump to Montrose, who goes to have a conversation with a security guard who is going to let them in after hours so that they can find the vault. And the two of them go downstairs. Now Atticus sees this and he becomes even more suspicious after what Tree has told them. He doesn't really say anything to Montrose at that point except to ask, how do you know him? And Montrose says that he's a friend of, but he doesn't say anything at that point, and Montrose asks, how do you know him? And Montrose goes on to say he's a friend, he's seen him at the bar. And Atticus kind of stares at him, but he doesn't follow up on it. Now they all go throughout the museum looking at different exhibits. Then we jump back to the scene with Hippolyta and her daughter, where we find out that there's a famous comet that they see in the exhibit, and that Hippolyta was the one that actually named that comet, but they gave the naming to someone else because they didn't want a little black girl to be known for naming that. And then her daughter shouts out that her mom was the one that named that comet. Now this scene is important because it tells us that actually Hippolyta has had a long time relationship with astrology, which also might give us some more information why she was drawn to the orrery. Now we head back to Chicago and we see Christina going into a house, and shortly after she goes into the house, William comes out, and then we notice that two men have been watching Christina in the car. William goes over to the car, beats the two men up, and basically says, now gentlemen, Christina doesn't like to be followed, and if you will excuse me, I have a date. Now here's an interesting thing here. Some of the dark siders have put this in the comments because they theorize that Christina and William are the same people, and this might just be true. So I want you to hold on to that thought because we're going to come back to that notion later on in this episode. Now if we move back to Boston, at this point it is after hours, and Letty, Montrose, and Atticus are breaking into the museum to try and find the vault. They examine a couple of things, and then they find a statue that they saw earlier. Looking at the statue, trying to figure out if there is some kind of secret access point within the statue. Montrose is looking up with a flashlight, and he figures out somehow that if they turn off their lights, it might be helpful. So everyone turns off their flashlights. There is a beam of light that goes onto the statue. Letty moves a piece of the statue where the light is shining, and then a door opens. And we can see that there is some kind of chasm below. So Atticus drops down in the chasm, and he's looking around, and he finds a text that gives some kind of warning about water or flooding. And then he makes a comment that this is like some old Journey to the Middle of Earth type stuff. Now that is the foreshadowing that we saw earlier in the library with the little kid who was reading that book. So then we jump back to Ruby, who's at the bar, and she's getting drunk because she's upset about her not getting the job at the clothing store. So someone at the bar is buying her drinks, and then we see that this is none other than William. So now we know that when William was saying that he had a date, he was talking about Ruby. So then the show takes us back to Letty, Atticus, and Montrose, who at this point are all under the museum. Now, they venture off into a certain tunnel. There were 3 tunnels to choose from. They chose this one. The show doesn't tell us why, but the show just tells us that they chose this tunnel. And as they're moving throughout the tunnel, they come to the end where there is a plank that leads from the tunnel off into the distance over a chasm. Now, the interesting thing is the chasm seems exceedingly deep because you cannot see the bottom of it, but nor can you see where the plank leads to as it goes off of the edge of the tunnel and on over the chasm. So they decide that Letty will be the one that walks across and finds out what's on the other side of the chasm. So as Letty's walking across the plank, something happens and she stops abruptly. Now we don't see what this is from the camera angle, but we do know that something is wrong, and Atticus calls out to her and he doesn't hear anything. So he goes out to get her, and he finds Letty crouched down in a position, and then he sees that there is a swinging blade that's going back and forth across the plank. It's a booby trap. So they have to try and figure out what to do there. Now if we jump back to Montrose, who is still at the ledge, we can see that the bridge is starting to disappear. So Atticus goes back for Montrose. Montrose jumps across onto the plank that's disappearing, and the two of them move across the plank, trying to beat the fact that it's disappearing under their feet. So they're all able to navigate the booby trap, and they get to the other side of the chasm where there is a stone wall that's blocking them from going any further, and we have the plank that's quickly disappearing. And if they don't get through this wall in time, the plank will disappear and then they will all fall into the chasm. Now they're trying to figure out how to get through this stone wall, which appears to have some different runes or symbols on it. So the wall needs a combination. Now Montrose remembers what he read from the book of the Order of Ancient Dawn. They press that and they're able to get through that barrier just as the plank disappears, and they find themselves in a tunnel that's flooded with water. And as they move through this tunnel, Letty notices that the water is rising. Then Atticus recalls what he read when he dropped down into the center of the room with the 3 tunnels about beware of rising water. And then they figure out that they only have an hour or so to find the vault before the tunnel is completely flooded and they all drown. So then we jump back to Ruby and William at the bar, and they're having a conversation, and Ruby tells her that she got distracted by Letty and that's probably why she didn't get the job. And then we find out that Letty is actually Ruby's half-sister. That's what she shares with William. Now this is an interesting thing because I think this even pulls Letty's character more into the forefront. I'm theorizing that if there are more than in fact one descendant from Titus, it could be the case that Letty could also be one of these descendants. And now we have the door for that to be possible because we know that she is Ruby's half-sister. So the two of them go back to what I believe is William's house and they become intimate. And my assessment of what's going on here is I think that somehow, some way he has hypnotized her. She is actually under his spell. So the two of them become intimate. We can see that there's some kind of strange tattoo on his chest. Now, a theory I had here initially, if William and Christina were the same people, that when they actually left the bar, they went back to Letty's house, which I think would have been interesting because we know, we know from earlier that Christina could not enter the house. But what I wondered is, could she enter the house if Letty had invited her into the house? I was thinking if Christina and William were the same people, and it was in fact the case that Ruby invited him into the house, then he would have access to the house. And if in fact Christina and William were the same person, now Christina would be able to come into the house and the spell wouldn't stop her. That was the theory that I had. So if we move back to Atticus, Letty, and Montrose as they're navigating the tunnel and they're still trying to find the vault. So as we keep coming through the tunnel, we actually come across the elevator that is part of Letty's house. And now we recognize that this is the tunnel that we saw at the end of episode 3 when it goes down past the ruins and opens the door and we see all these bodies. But the tunnel at that point is not flooded, but we recognize it also because the lights light up like we saw in that scene. We know that there must be something magical about this tunnel because Boston is not close to Illinois. So they continue the search and they actually find the vault. Now when they come across the vault, they see that there is an arm actually in the hole of the vault door. They remove the arm, but they're a little skeptical because that's all that's there. There's an arm. The rest of the body is gone. So they remove the arm and they're not sure how to unlock the vault. Now Atticus sees that the arm that was there before had his hand inside of what looked to be an open hole, so he puts on his ring and he just takes a chance. He puts his hand in there and turns the lever, and then we see something clamp down on his arm and we begin to see blood in the water, and Atticus starts to scream and he's getting ready to pull his arm out, but then he says wait, because he looks up and he notices that there's also blood over these symbols on the top of the vault, and then it begins to unlock and we see a ladder drop down from the ceiling. They all climb up the ladder into this room that is full of all these different bodies, and apparently they've been there for a long time because they actually look like an ancient indigenous race. Letty spots what looks like to be the scroll on the table and she goes over to it, and Atticus reaches out to grab the scroll, and as she does, there's a woman's arm that's clutching the scroll and she is basically skin and bones. You can tell she's been there for a very long time, and she begins to reanimate. She comes to life. And then Atticus finds out that Titus has in fact spread his cruelty to a lot of people over a long period of time. So Atticus explains that he's sorry about what happened after hearing her story and asks her for her help to defeat others like Titus. But she's a little skeptical because she trusted Titus initially and she doesn't know Atticus, so she doesn't want to help him. So they decide to take the scroll and leave, and as they do, that room begins to flood and they all leave the room together, including the woman that was in the room. They all jump down through the hole back into the tunnel and they swam towards the elevator to try and raise the elevator to leave the flooded room. Now as they're doing that, the current pushes the scrolls out of Letty's hand and back into the tunnel. As she goes to swim after the scroll, she finally gets the scroll. She gets back into the elevator. Atticus pushes the button at the nick of time, which raises the elevator, and they're able to breathe. As the elevator is ascending, the woman that's with them lets out this high-pitched scream, and we find out that some kind of spell has been placed on her that affects her ability to communicate if she leaves that cave. Atticus says something to the effect of trying to figure out a way to help her, and then possibly even teaching her English, which would help them decipher the Book of Names even faster. So all of them go their separate ways, and Montrose goes into the room where the woman is, and then he walks behind her, and then he tells her, "I'm sorry," as he cuts her throat. Told you something wasn't right with that dude. I don't trust him. Something's not right with Montrose. One of the things I liked about episode 4 was the visual appeal. I thought the cinematography was particularly good in this episode, especially when we dealt with the level of CGI that we had in this. I was impressed by that. And I was also impressed with the direction of this episode, because I thought that that was particularly well done also. I loved Christina in this episode. There is something about her character that makes her really special. And the performances from the others were great as well. And I felt like we learned some really important things that we need to progress the story as we move forward in the season. But the biggest problem with this show is that there's too much going on here. There's too much going on here. You have the turn of the storyline with Ruby. You have what's going on with Atticus and those as they find the vault. You have what's going on with Hippolyta as she finds out more about the orrery. There's too much happening here. You have Hippolyta, who now wants to go and find out some more answers about what happened to George. You have what's going on with Montrose as we begin to develop his character more. All of that in one episode is too much. And I can only think that they did that because of the episodes to come. And this episode was a setup for the things that are going to come later on in this season. That's the only reason why I can figure out why they gave us so much in this episode. But it definitely felt cluttered. Thanks for hanging out with me, Darksiders, and deep diving into episode 4 of Lovecraft County. To see more of what we've done around the Lovecraft show, check it out right there. And I'll meet you there. Let's go. Peace.